It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Here's truly Warner Lewis from the Flight Deck. And as always, that means some smart talk radio is in your future in this segment, one that we have not talked about before, and that is the unique, tenuous relationship between life and death. Going to be talking to Adrian Owen. He's the author of a new work called Into the Gray Zone. A neuroscientist explores the border between life and death. He is currently the Canadian Excellence Research Chair in Cognitive Neuroscience and Imaging at the Brain and Mind Institute at Western University in Canada. He spent the last 20 years pioneering breakthroughs in cognitive neuroscience. He can be found at owenlab.org. Should be an interesting conversation indeed. Adrian, how are you, my friend?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Well, we're pleased to have you here. We have not, in almost 20 years of this show, we have not had any neuroscientists on, to my memory anyway. Explain a little bit, if you would, to our Lewis at Large listeners, a little bit about what the work that you do. And then I'd like to also get, if you have one, is there a clinical definition between what is living and what is dead?
Right, well, I'll tackle the first question first because that was a lot easier. So I'm a neuroscientist. What we do is we use techniques that involve brain imaging, brain scanning, MRIs. Most people will be familiar with those. And we use that to do two things, really. One, to try and understand how the healthy brain works. And two, to try and understand what's gone wrong when there's been some kind of catastrophic brain injury. And by that, I mean a traumatic brain injury, like what may happen in a car accident, for example, or a non-traumatic injury, something like a stroke or a loss of oxygen to the brain caused through a heart attack. And these things often leave patients with a so-called disorder of consciousness, and that's something like a vegetative state or a coma, where we can never be really clear what is left, whether they're still in there, whether any part of them is still in there. We use these sophisticated brain imaging techniques to try and probe that and understand a little bit more about these patients. And that brings me to answering your second question, which is what is there? And I refer to this as the gray zone between life and death, and that is any situation in which the brain has been damaged to the extent that we really don't know. And as I try and explain in the book, there are many surprises that one can find when one starts probing the brains of people who are stuck in this so-called gray zone between life and death.
You know, we know a lot more about the heart now than we did even 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Same way with several other organs. What about this extraordinary thing called the brain? Where are we, in your opinion, in terms of our evolution of the knowledge of how it works, how it functions, and its capabilities?
Well, I think we've done extremely well in the last 25 years in terms of accelerating our understanding of brain function. Sometimes it's very difficult for us as neuroscientists working in that area to remember how little we knew 25 years ago. Now, in my particular area, for example, when we first put a patient who was in a so-called vegetative state in a scan, and that was 20 years ago, almost to the day. At that time, nobody would believe that any of these patients had any residual awareness, had any sense of being anything, really. I was told many times that this would be a complete waste of time and money. Yet 20 years on, not only do we understand that many of these patients do have some sense of awareness, some sense of who they are and where they are and the predicament that they're in, but we also know quite a lot about why it is that brain damage can put patients into this gray zone, into this weird place between life and death. And we know that because of advances in neuroscience, because of very sophisticated new brain scanning techniques that can show us with exquisite detail tiny bits of damage in the brain and tell us exactly where they are and the sort of impact that they're having on normal brain function. So, sorry, long answer to your question, but I think we've come a very long way, even though we still have an enormous amount to learn.
By being able to start to see some of these things that we could not see before, looking into the dark edges, so to speak, hopefully that allows more research in the ability to either cure or to repair some of that. Is that correct, or am I looking at it the wrong way?
No, I think you're looking at it exactly the right way. And the way I often try to express it is that, unless you know exactly what has gone wrong, you're never going to be able to begin to fix it, unless you know where the problem is. And I think that's true of most brain disorders. You have to really, truly understand them, and that's at the level of the neurochemistry, the neuropathology, where the damage is, exactly what the nature of the damage is. And I think only then can we begin to design therapies to reverse that process and try and fix some of these problems.
Share with our listeners, if someone is in a coma, and I'll liken, if someone were into surgery with was heavily anesthetized, is that state of the brain, are those similar? What is sort of the clinical definition, I guess, brain activity wise, of a coma?
So a coma is typically the first thing that will happen to you after you have a very serious brain injury. And to the untrained eye, a person who is in a coma looks as though they are asleep. They have closed eyes, they don't have sleeping and waking cycles, they don't typically move very much. What we're really interested in are the conditions that come after that. Now, often a person in a coma will awaken and they will move or transition into a so-called vegetative state. And that's in many ways like a coma, except these patients open their eyes. They have sleeping and waking cycles. They'll occasionally grunt and groan. They'll even look around the room, but they won't respond to anything in the outside world. If you say, well, look this way or look that way, that they won't do it. If you ask them to squeeze your hand, they won't do it. And this is an extremely, in many ways it's disturbing, but it's also a mysterious condition, because these patients look as though there's something going on. They look as though they should have some awareness of the world, but there's no evidence that that's the case. And that's the condition that's really at the heart of my book, that we tried to explore over the last 20 years to establish that some of these patients actually aren't what they appear to be at all. They do have some residual awareness, and writing them off as having, or calling them awake but unaware, as they are often referred to, is actually a catastrophic mistake.
Well, if you just joined us, again, yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck of Lewis at Large, talking to Adrian Owen. He's currently the Canada Excellent Research Chair in the Cognitive Neuroscience and Imaging at the Brain and Mind Institute at Western University in Canada. Last 20 years, pioneering breakthrough in cognitive neuroscience and research. Brand new work called Into the Gray Zone. And Adrian, this gray zone, again, raises all kinds of sort of ethical questions, undoubtedly, when someone either towards the end of life or any time of life, and the brain is not functioning in a way and they're not cognitive, as you were talking about. What kinds of ethical questions do you think get raised by this, and are you finding any answers as a result?
Absolutely, and I think it raises a lot of interesting ethical questions. I mean, one of them is, of course, there are lots of very frequently you'll see this in the news, that a decision is being made, typically by a court or a family with the assistance from the courts, about whether to withdraw nutrition and hydration from a patient who may have been declared to be in a vegetative state. And in most of those situations, the assumption is that patient has no awareness, no sense of who they are and the predicament that they're in. Another assumption is often that the prognosis is not very good, that they have no chance of recovery. And, some of these new techniques that we and other people are developing are designed to address both of those issues. First, is it true? Can we use these brain imaging techniques to establish that some of these patients actually do have some awareness? And if they do have some awareness, could we could we communicate with them and actually get them involved in the decision-making process? And secondly, can we use these techniques to prognosticate, to actually get better at determining who is likely to make a recovery and who isn't? And I can tell you that in both of those areas, we've been making tremendous progress over the last few years. And I think that does, as you say, come with some fairly hefty ethical implications.
What about the medical community in general? Do they side with you? Do they agree that there are opportunities here that we're aware of now because of our ability now to know so much more information and to probe more with the advances in neuroscience? Or are they still pushing back and saying, look, brain dead is brain dead, so to speak?
I think it depends on who you speak to. I mean, obviously, I work very closely with clinical teams because all of these patients are, or at least all of the patients that we see, are subject to regular neurological examinations and evaluations and so on. So I get a lot of support from the clinicians and the physicians around me. As far as the community at large is concerned, I think with time, this has come to be an accepted fact. I mean, when we first showed in 2006, 10 years ago now, that some vegetative patients actually have preserved consciousness, are actually aware, even though they appear not to be. It was met, I think, with a fair amount of skepticism, and it really took us several years of replications and demonstrating and writing about many patients in these situations before I think it's become fairly widely accepted that a significant minority of these patients aren't what they appear to be. But it's like all scientific discoveries. It takes a little bit of time for it to trickle down into general clinical acceptance. And in my case, writing the book was really an effort to push this out into general public knowledge as well, because I think this is an issue that is of enormous interest to the general public, and I really wanted to write about it in a way that was accessible to everybody and in a way that everybody could take something away from about themselves and about their own lives.
What has been, if you look over the course of the research you've done the last 5 to 10 years, what has been some of the biggest breakthroughs, so to speak, and the biggest revelations to you, not only clinically, but maybe even ethically, and just how we look at the brain and how it operates in general?
I think one of the biggest breakthroughs was in 2010. We published a scientific paper showing that we could actually communicate with a patient who was assumed to be entirely vegetative. And I have a whole chapter in the book devoted to this. This is a gentleman who'd been in a vegetative state supposedly for 5 years. So he'd had no responses. His family had been unable to communicate with him. Everybody thought he was long gone. We put him into a brain scanner, and we developed a method that allowed us to ask him simple yes and no questions about the situation he was in and what he understood about his situation. I think that, for me, was the sort of pivotal moment when I realized that we'd come to a point where there was this incredible collision between science, technology, and medicine, that we could do things that really would never be imaginable 10 years ago, and there we were doing them. Since then, I mean, you raised the ethical question. Since then, one of the things that's really opened my eyes has been how one could apply this technique. So we've asked a number of patients much more probing questions, like, for example, are you in pain? We've used the technique to establish whether any of these patients are actually in any pain, and where necessary, we can do something about that. And questions that can really affect people's quality of life. And again, that to me has really opened my eyes to the amazing possibilities that these new technologies will bring to medicine, both now and in future years.
You're in Canada, but what about those that are in similar fields in the United States and in the Western Hemisphere? Is the research is that cutting-edge research in the West, or is that not necessarily true?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of gone from being, I would say, a sort of a cottage industry 20 years ago to being a much bigger deal now. And when we started out, very few people worked with these patients. I think it's true to say that calling patients in the grey zone a lost population was not an exaggeration 20 years ago. But as we've moved on and we've made more scientific breakthroughs, there are groups in the United States who are working on this. There are groups in Europe. I spent a lot of time in Cambridge in the UK working with a group there. And so this is really an international effort now, and several of us have international grants that we share between us and across borders, because we all have slightly different types of expertise, and you can't work on your own. Working together across borders and in international groups is a very effective way of moving the science forward, quickly and efficiently.
What is sort of next for you, Adrian? Again, you've done a lot of research, and I know it's probably ongoing, but can you share with us a little bit some of the research you're engaged in now, and what are your plans for the near future?
Yeah, so everything that I've spoken about so far in this conversation, and everything I really write about in my book, is about patients who have been in this situation for a long time, months, years, sometimes even in decades. And I think that's very interesting. There's some really astonishing stories in there. But I think it's time that we turned our attention to the first few days after a brain injury. And that's really where I'm working at the moment, looking at patients who are in the intensive care unit. They're often on life support machines. And they may have, typically they'll have had a road accident or a stroke or another type of brain injury just a few days earlier. Because I think some of these techniques that we've been working with can be easily applied in that situation. Now, I probably shouldn't have used the word easy there, because this is extremely difficult science. Getting patients who are on life support machines into MRI scanners is an extremely difficult thing to do, but that is exactly what we're doing here in London right now, and we're having tremendous success with it in two areas. One is improving the diagnosis, having a better idea of exactly how bad is the brain damage in this patient? What situation are they actually in? And what are we looking at? And the other is improving the prognosis. Who is going to recover, or who is likely to recover, and who has very little chance of recovery? And, that's a much more important question in the first few days after a brain injury, because that's where decisions are being made on an hourly basis rather than on a yearly basis. And, decisions to, quotes, pull the plug, are often made in a very small time window after a very serious brain injury. And I think if we can contribute to understanding whether that's the right or the wrong decision with some of these sophisticated techniques, I think we really will make a very important difference.
Brain injuries happen every day. They happen in little towns. They happen in big cities. My assumption is that the centers where this sophisticated equipment is are either in university communities or certainly in larger markets. Are there ways that to communicate either, again, online somehow or whatever, where some of this equipment and some of this these processes can be used on people even if they're not in the same room?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. One of the things we've spent a lot of time doing in the last few years is working out how we can get some of these these sophisticated technologies out of the universities into the hospitals, because that is an important question, as you say. And in fact, we published a paper last year, literally comparing brain scans taken in our sort of high-end, top-of-the-line brain scanner at the university to brain scans taken in the same participants in a very old and somewhat dilapidated brain scanner in the local hospital. And we were able to demonstrate that actually if you do it right and you do it very carefully, you can get pretty much the same results in both. So these are technologies that are transferable to situations in which you don't necessarily have all of the fancy equipment that we have available to us in the university. Beyond that, I think you have to look into the future and for techniques that one could take entirely out of the situation. I think there are possibilities on the horizon. There is a technique known as functional near-infrared spectroscopy. I won't say that again, which we're developing and other people have been working with too, that I'm hoping will allow us to communicate with some of these patients even in their own homes. This is portable technology. It's cost-effective technology. It's way, way cheaper than something like MRI. And we know that we can put it in the back of our car in a suitcase and drive it to a patient, actually take it to their home or to their hospital or to their care home, and try and make contact with them right there.
What about, Adrian, if we start to kind of wind down here again, let me jump a little bit away from brain injury and go towards brain disease. Is any of the work that you're doing, how does it relate to those that have diseases of the brain, and in any way, shape, or form, how is it helping?
I think that's a very interesting question, and I think it's helping in two ways. One is just by doing this science and by developing this technology for patients with brain injury, it often pushes the science forward in lots of other areas too. So some of the techniques that we've developed to try and assess the extent of a brain injury, if you use them to look at the brain of a patient with Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease, it will also allow you to get a much better sense of what's going on there. So the technology or the science is transferable in that sense. The other area or the other answer to the question is a slightly more neuroscientific answer, which is that what this working in this area has taught me over the last 20 years is that people are very rarely what they appear to be. The most obvious example of this that I have in my own research is that the patient who might appear to be comatose or vegetative, it turns out often they're not in that situation at all, and they have some level of residual awareness. And what about then patients in the late stages of Alzheimer's disease? Often these patients have a very similar problem, and in the book I suggest that these patients are also, in a sense, in some kind of grey zone, in that they lose an aspect of their personhood. They cease to be exactly the person they used to be with the personality that they used to be. But we still know very little about what it's like to be that person. What is it actually like to be in the middle or the late stages of Alzheimer's disease? We know what happens in what the brain does, or what the disease has done to the brain, but what's it actually like to experience that? And some of these techniques are also allowing us to shed light on that bigger, sort of more philosophical question.
Well, it is a fascinating topic, the human brain. The work is called Into the Gray Zone, and neuroscientist explores the border between life and death. We've been talking to Adrian Owen, again, currently the Canadian Excellence Research Chair in Cognitive Neuroscience and Imaging at the Brain and Mind Institute at Western University in Canada. Adrian, how can people find out a little bit more about some of the work that you do, and also maybe pick up a copy of Into the Gray Zone?
Well, they can get a copy of Into the Gray Zone pretty much anywhere, online, Amazon, or there is a website, intothegrayzone.com. If you go there, you can watch videos of the patients that I talk about in the book. You can read an excerpt from the book. You can get a little bit more information about what's in there. I'd also encourage people to test their own brains. We have another website called cambridgebrainsciences.com. It's all one word, cambridgebrainsciences.com. People go there. They can test their own brains. They can assess things like memory, attention, planning, and decision-making, and even monitor how their brain changes over time. And this is something I'm a huge fan of this. I think people are used to testing their blood pressure or testing their heart rate. People should think about testing their brains occasionally, and we've made this platform available for people to do that. So, yes, I would very much encourage your listeners to visit that site too.
Well, thank you so much for spending some of your valuable time with us today. Appreciate your insights, both scientific and those involving some moral questions, quite frankly. And best of luck to you, and would love to have you back on again sometime.
Thank you. It would be my pleasure. Thanks very much.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.